Evening. Daryl, can I go ahead and start? Can I go ahead and start? Good evening, everyone. I'm Stu Grubb. I'm the chairman of the Freshwater Society Board of Directors. I'd like to welcome you all here tonight to the Moose Family Speaker Series on Water Resources, sponsored by the Freshwater Society and the University of Minnesota's College of Biological Sciences. We would also like to thank our partner, the Canadian Consulate General, who made possible the reception earlier this evening. The Consul General Jamshed Merchant will join us later as part of the panel. This lecture series honors Malcolm Moose, a former University of Minnesota president. I would urge those of you who are not Freshwater Society members yet to pick up an envelope on your way out or at the table later and fill it out and join us as a part of this organization. Thanks to Dr. Tom Hayes, the interim dean of the College of Biological Sciences. Dean Hayes will moderate the question and answer period after our lecture. So welcome to all of you and to the people who are watching us on streaming video. Since February 2010, we've hosted 17 lectures with national and international leaders on many subjects, including fracking or hydraulic fracturing, groundwater sustainability, rural and urban pollution of surface waters, endocrine disruptors of our lakes and rivers, water and air pollution from nitrogen, and invasive carp. Tonight we turn our attention to large lakes. 20 large lakes contain about 2/3 of our available freshwater. That's hard to believe, but it's true. Given that it would seem that they would have a huge influence on the people, economics, governments, and ecosystems near and far, but to what extent? What role do these lakes play in our lives? So the Freshwater Society and the College of Biological Sciences and our partners are pleased to have Dr. Robert Sterner from the Large Lakes Observatory join us to help answer this question by looking at these lakes through the lenses of hydrology, biogeochemistry, biodiversity, and geopolitics. One of Professor Stern's earliest memories is nighttime sailing with his family on Lake Michigan off of Chicago. He's been attracted to lakes ever since. His work with zooplankton began when he encountered Michael Lynch as a biology student at the University of Illinois. Dr. Lynch's lab was full of glass jars of these fascinating creatures. Later, Dr. Sterner went to graduate school at the University of Minnesota as the first PhD student of the well-known ecologist David Tillman. There, Robert began thinking about how fascinating creatures fit into the broader nutrient cycles of lakes. His PhD work in limnology and then his postdoctoral research at the Max Planck Institute for Limnology in Germany laid the groundwork for an ecological approach, now called ecological stoichiometry, that examines how nutrient content of organisms shapes their ecology and evolution. And in 2002, he co-authored a major book on the topic. He began his first faculty position in 1987 at the University of Texas at Arlington before joining the University of Minnesota faculty in 1994. He was initially based at the Gray Freshwater Biological Institute, where the Freshwater Society is now located. Budget constraints led to the university to close the Gray, and Robert moved to the main campus. He has served as the head of the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior at the U of M, as well as the director of the Division of Environmental Biology at the U.S. National Science Foundation. His move to Minnesota in 1994 brought Robert into the gravitational pull of Earth's largest lake by area. His research since then has included studies of Lake Superior. His move to Duluth as the new director of the Large Lakes Observatory and member of the faculty of the Department of Biology puts him back into an interdisciplinary water center, an academic environment he values, and it brings him even closer to the shores of the Big Lake. Dr. Sterner's talk tonight is titled The Outsized Role of Earth's Largest Lakes. As usual, we'll have a panel of Minnesota experts who will join Dr. Sterner in answering questions from the audience. There'll be more about the panelists later from Dean Hayes. You should have received some file cards when you entered. Please write your questions down, and the Freshwater Society staff will collect them at the end of the presentation. If you do not receive a card or if you need something to write with, just raise your hand and somebody will bring it to you. So finally, please help me welcome Dr. Sterner.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out on such a beautiful evening. Thanks, Stu, for the great introduction, very generous one. It is terrific to be here, to come back to St. Paul. I've spent 20-plus years on this campus. I know it quite well, and it's great to be here and have this opportunity to talk to you tonight. Fair warning, this is a very general lecture. I'm kind of weary of giving talks where maybe 10 people in the world really understand what I'm saying. So we're gonna keep this light and general, and I'm going to try to communicate to you a number of different, I think, really interesting and meaningful stories about these features of Earth that that I've been studying, and that now I have a greater opportunity to deal with in my new position as the director of LLO, or the Large Lakes Observatory, at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. So I chose this title, The Outsized Role of Large Lakes. I like to think about this talk as, well, how do these lakes shape human society, and how have we shaped them? So I suppose this is not a controversial statement in this room, but this is an article from The Economist from not too long ago with a story entitled The World's Most Valuable Stuff, and it's a picture of a young person drinking some water. And the story in The Economist goes on to talk about how we have markets, and we in fact, people have gone to war over resources such as oil, but according to this article, fresh water is essential for life. There's no substitute. It's mostly unpriced, and they call it the most valuable stuff in the world. I'm also kind of a big fan of oxygen, so yeah, I don't know what that means, but I think we all agree it's essential to life. It's a valuable resource, and this business of how do we price it will kind of trickle through my talk at different points. How do we relate to it in terms of how we trade and how we shape our society? So before we get going really on the kind of the meat of the talk, I wanted to show you kind of where I'm coming from in this topic. I am a hard scientist. I do studies on nutrients and carbon dynamics, and I make lots of measurements and make graphs and stuff and present papers. And now when I'm working on Lake Superior, it's typically from this research platform. This is the research vessel Blue Heron, which is we call it the most capable research vessel on the Great Lakes. It's 90 feet long. We can put 6 scientists at a time on board and go all over the lake. This is an instrument package that we're lowering into Lake Superior. The package has a lot of electronics, and as this gets lowered in the water, the data from that goes back up the cable and on board, and we take water samples from that. This is a device that lands on the lake bottom, and actually plastic tubes get pushed into the bottom, and we pull that back on board, and we get a record of lake sediments, something a little less than a meter long, using that device. And in Lake Superior, that's centuries of time represented in that one core. So I just kind of wanted to use an opportunity to show you a fun video and give you a little flavor for these environments. Here we are in this really big boat in this enormous lake, and working in these environments is challenging. It's not always as nice a day as it is here in this picture. And it is also very expensive to do this work. So that's where I'm coming from. Now, here's this iconic image of Earth, the water planet, right? Most of the surface of Earth is covered with water. You look at this iconic image, and your brain says water, 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 water. And the volume of water seems very great from this picture because most of Earth's surface is blue. But our brain does funny things with depth when we're looking at bodies of water. We tend psychologically to greatly overemphasize depth in our brains. So what I want to do for you now is show you actually what the whole volume of water on Earth actually looks like. Here we go. There you go. That's every drop of water on Earth, salty, fresh, oceanic, etc. That's the actual volume. Earth is blue because you take that tiny droplet, looks tiny in this picture, and spread it out and cover a lot of the surface of Earth. But it's a very thin film of water. We'll make the same point a little bit later in the talk when we're looking at some data on the size of Lake Superior. So I think instead of thinking about Earth as this water planet where there's this limitless supply of this, if we could just figure out how to get the salt out and everything like this, it actually really isn't that much water that we have to work with. And then, of course, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but here's some kind of, graphical representation of this. This is all the water on Earth, again, represented as a pie chart. And the big blue slice of pie is the water that's in Earth's oceans. And then there's a little green wedge, which represents ice. There's a fair bit of water locked up in the ice caps and other forms of places where there's ice on Earth. There's a measurable amount, a visible amount of water on Earth in groundwater. That's the little yellow wedge that you can barely see. And then the little thing sticking out that really has no width at all in this picture because it's 1 pixel. That's the water in lakes, rivers, and the air. That's the water really which human society uses for growing our food, growing our fiber, carrying away our wastes, not to mention what we use to drink. It's practically nothing relative to that little droplet on Earth that we saw in the picture before. So we take that almost invisible wedge of fresh water, and now we explode it and make a little pie out of it. And we say, what is that wedge like? Well, the water in lakes, rivers, and air turns out to be almost half of it is saline. And much of that turns out actually to be in one water body, the Caspian Sea. It has a very big volume. It's very salty water. It's not part of the oceans. It's no longer connected to the oceans it used to be. You could call it a lake, but then Lake Superior would be number 2, so we don't do that. Fresh water, the water that runs our society, is that greenish color wedge, which is about half of that almost invisible thing that we already looked at. Now that greenish colored wedge, which is really all of the fresh water that we rely on, breaks down like this. Now we have a bunch of different colors. The blue one at the upper right is all of Earth's fresh water, liquid form, that's in a single place on Earth in Siberia called Lake Baikal. Next, Tanganyika, 15% of the water. Superior, 9%. Malawi, 6. Vostok, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, 4. Michigan, 4. Huron, 3. Victoria in Africa, 2. Great Bear in Canada, 2. Issyk-Kul in Asia, 2. All others on Earth, 34. So the message here is there isn't so much water available to us, and its distribution is about as heterogeneous as it possibly could be. Most of it is located in just a few spots on Earth. Here's the same message in a table for those of you who prefer numbers, but we'll make a few other points here. So the total volume of water in freshwater lakes, the upper line of that table, says it's 125 thousands of cubic kilometers, but 125 in freshwater lakes. There it is. And then, again, we break that down. Again, a list of lakes, those top 10, thousands of cubic kilometers per lake, and the percent of global. And now we're adding up. This is cumulative. So we start with 19% in Baikal. Then we add Tanganyika's water. We get 34%. We add Superior's water to that. We're up to 43%. We add Malawi, and we're almost at half. And we add Vostok, and now we're over half. Over half of Earth's fresh water, basically in these 5 places. It's an amazing thing to think about. So 5 lakes contain really more than half of global total liquid fresh water. And here's an interesting point. The column in the left table that we just talked about with all the lakes, there's also a column in that table for countries. That's the number of countries that touch these immense water bodies. So Baikal, it's 1. It's Russia. Tanganyika, actually 4 African countries border Tanganyika. Superior, of course, 2, etc. On the right there is a list of countries that have a border on one of these vast, huge freshwater resources. The countries who have ready access to 66% of Earth's fresh water are Burundi, Canada, DR Congo, Kenya, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, Tanzania, Uganda, USA, and Zambia. Here is what we maybe want to call Earth's most valuable resource, and here are the countries that have access to it. That's a fascinating list. Some already powerful countries, some very, today, unpowerful countries on this list. So what does it mean about the future that these are the countries that have direct access to that thing we can call Earth's most valuable resource? What does that mean about the future? Interesting question. I don't have an answer. I'm hoping you'll think about it. So here's my first message for tonight. It's a handful of dimples on Earth's surface. It's just a small number of environments where we have basically such a tremendous volume of this really precious resource, a handful of dimples on Earth. Here's another way to look at this. This is a figure from a book published in 1987. That date will be important in a minute, showing all of the large lakes of Earth, at scale, at the same scale on this figure. And the Caspian Sea, Buhis, is on the right. Lake Superior, otherwise the Earth's largest lake, upper left. There they all are, and there's England in the inset. So here's all these environments, and interesting thing to me about this right now, this was published in 1987, Earth's largest lakes, and it turns out since 1987 there have been 2 changes to this list. How can that be that in clearly our lifetimes we have changed the list of the identity of the large lakes of Earth? Well, two ways that has changed. It's Lake Vostok and the Aral Sea. So you may be thinking ahead for me a little bit. But Lake Vostok has appeared on the list, and the Aral Sea has dropped off. Let's talk about both of those. So Vostok is the fourth or fifth, I've forgotten already, largest lake on Earth. It's under 1 mile to 2 miles of ice in Antarctica. And it was in the early, I have this on the next slide, but I'll tell you now, it was in the early 50s that it was first theorized that there may be liquid water under the ice in Antarctica. The calculation was made that with the tremendous pressure of ice, which lowers the freezing point of water, and the geothermal heat coming up from the rocks below, there could possibly be liquid water under the ice in Antarctica. Well, today, with the kinds of high-power radar imaging and things we have today, now we know a lot more about those resources. And all the blue stuff is liquid water in Antarctica, under ice. And Lake Vostok is there, indicated with the arrow and such. Fifth largest lake on Earth, under all this ice. Turns out Antarctica has hundreds of subglacial lakes, with Lake Vostok being the largest of those. The first seismic hint that Lake Vostok existed was in 1959. And the final discovery, in quotes, that's the way it's usually told, happened in 1993. Basically, in 1993, radar had become powerful enough that you could get a good image through a mile or two of ice, and we had this image that you see in the slide now of the fifth largest lake on Earth. You may have also heard the story that scientists, it turns out from Russia, have bored through this ice in an attempt to take some samples from Lake Vostok. It was very controversial, with many people worrying about possible contamination of a water body that had not been exposed to air for 10 million years or more. The first borehole went down, and antifreeze was being poured in the hole to keep the borer from freezing up. And the way I read the story, I just read the news about this, but the borehole was accidentally lengthened to the point where the remaining ice broke through, and the antifreeze in the borehole was potentially exposed to the lake water that hadn't been, exposed to the air for 10 million years. It is possibly, maybe even probably the case that the great pressure of water of Lake Vostok shot the water up through the borehole and not a drop of chemicals or anything entered the lake. That maybe is what happened. We don't really know. A fresh borehole was also made, allegedly clean, and broke through just a few months ago, allowing scientists to take the first samples of this lake water. So the lake was discovered in 93, if you want to call it that, and the first sample, really, that we can rely on was taken just a few months ago. So the second message I have for you, discovery continues. To me, this is an incredibly positive story about human beings. The quest for knowledge, the advance in our ability to understand nature around us, has allowed us to do things like add lakes to the list of, this list of these amazingly huge features of Earth's surface. We're changing that because we're discovering things. That's an incredible story of scientific progress, and a positive story about people, I think. Now the Aral Sea. I wish I could say that was a positive story. Many of you know this story. I'll talk about it quickly. But here is the largest lakes on Earth by area. Caspian Sea, Buhis, Superior, yay. Number 4 is the historic Aral Sea. And that's why it appeared in that book figure from 1987 as a very big black blob. And I'm willing to bet everybody out there has heard some of this story. So it was once the fourth largest lake on Earth by area. Limnologists call lakes like this endorheic. So if you want to learn one word tonight, there you go. Endorheic means it has no outflow. Water flows in, but there's no direct outflow. The only way water is lost is by evaporation. So there's a concentration of salts. And what happened with the Aral Sea? Well, that business about it being endorheic means it's also very sensitive to the inflow. If we change the inflow, we're going to do a lot to the volume of this lake. And through something which has this almost impossibly kind of, I don't know the right way to put it, but the Soviet government of the Stalin era came up with something called the Great Plan for the Transformation of Nature, which included taking that whole southern part, because Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, these used to be part, of course, of the Soviet Union. And the part of the Great Plan for the Transformation of Nature was to take water out of those rivers that are there in blue and irrigate the land and grow cotton especially, but some other crops. And for a while, that worked in the sense that a lot of cotton was, in fact, grown in this region of the world. Not so much anymore. If we irrigate the desert for a long period of time, bad things happen. The soil gets saline. Cotton yields are way down, but it worked for a while in terms of growing cotton. Now, how many here are wearing cotton? I mean, like everyone, right? I am. Look, cotton is evil. There's hardly anything that uses more water, that uses more chemicals that we use in our day-to-day life than cotton, but we love it. So, where are you going to point the finger? Anyway, the Aral Sea, so the water coming into this endorheic basin was diverted, put on land, cotton was grown, and part of the story that's seldom told, to me, is terribly interesting because I don't know how much history of this time some of you know or remember, but this was a part of the Soviet Union that was quite restless. A lot of Muslims there. There was not a good relationship between Central Soviet government and this part of their country. And prior to the Great Plan for the Transformation of Nature, there was a thriving, what we may today call sustainable community of people basically living off the fisheries of the Aral Sea. And instead of that, we turned this region of the world into gigantic collective farms growing cotton. So we completely disrupted the lives of the people who had been living there for centuries. So, yeah, do we use water as a weapon against each other? You bet we do. And I think of this as one of those stories. So here are the total catches of fish in the Aral Sea in dark and gray, northern and southern regions, 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, basically going down to nothing in the 1980s. I'm sure many of you have seen these images. Basically, the fishing got so bad and the lake was drying up so fast, there was no point in saving the fishing boats. So they were just left, and the lake dried up and the boats were left stranded. And there are some people today harvesting cotton. So we've dropped a lake off of the list of the biggest ones on Earth, and we did it through conscious policy, conscious decisions. Look, the people who did this knew dang well what would happen. There's no accident involved in taking water from a place like the Aral Sea and putting it on land. So this was simple hydrology. So there's the big iconic image, 1980s and today. There are plans trying to rescue pieces of this, and there are some tiny successes to be told. But the message for me, from me to you today, is this: basically two pieces. These massive water projects seem almost irresistible. They happen all over the world. It sounds like I'm just beating up on one country or one place. But whether we're talking about the Soviets, whether we're talking about Muammar Gaddafi, whether we're talking about John F. Kennedy, governments love big water projects. And look, some of them probably are essential and valuable, and we want to have them. But there are also huge problems that we could do a much better job managing. We are in control. It's not only the sun and gravity controlling Earth's water. It's our decisions that basically are in control today of the Earth's hydrological cycle. The next story. We're going to do a little tiny bit of ecology here. This is something called the species area curve, which is a very intuitive thing. It basically says you have more, if you count up the number of species in an area, you'll have more species in a big area than a small area. Nothing more to it than that. If we count the number of plant species in a little tiny plot of land, there will only be a few. If we count the number of plant species in a gigantic forest, we'll have many, many. The interesting thing ecologically, it turns out, I don't really need this information, but I'll pass it on anyway. The interesting thing ecologically is this fits some kind of a mathematical function called a power law. Ecologists still don't totally understand that. So we're still trying to figure out some aspects of species area curves. All I want to do today is make the very obvious, simple point that big places have lots of species. We're talking about big lakes now. Big lakes have lots of species. They're ginormous. They have lots of different habitats. You know, we're talking about hundreds of fish species instead of one or two in a lot of cases. So these large lakes of Earth are valuable because of the water they have, but also because of the biodiversity that they have. So let's talk about biodiversity a little bit. So here is where some of Earth's large lakes are all clustered. This is East Africa. It's a rift valley where the continents are splitting, continental plates are splitting apart, leaves a very deep trench running north-south through East Africa, and that deep trench fills up with water, and we have those long, narrow lakes on the left, and actually we're going to end up talking now about the round one on the right. The round one on the right is called Lake Victoria. It's part of this system within East Africa. One of the most famous things about all these lakes in East Africa is the tremendous fish diversity. And so this is a very busy figure from a recent paper showing the diversity of fish species in these different East African lakes. Different colors represent different kinds of fish. The blue color, which is the biggest circles on there, those are the cichlid fishes that I'll concentrate on here with you. But there are other kinds of fish, well, actually organisms, non-cichlid fishes, ostracods, gastropods, and bivalves as well. But we'll concentrate on those cichlid fishes. Lake Victoria, that we'll talk about primarily now, 600 species of cichlid fishes. Now, if you're an aquarist or if you've just wandered through a pet shop that has well-stocked aquarium display, I'm sure you've seen some of these fish. They're these brightly colored, they call them usually African cichlids. They're really quite gorgeous. We'll talk about the color in a minute, but they're small, typically, and there are many, many of them. They tend to be really aggressive. About 600 species of these cichlids are found in one lake in Africa, Lake Victoria, and nowhere else. About 250 species in Tanganyika, about 800 species in Malawi. And Tanganyika and Malawi have been lakes for millions of years. It's very easy to explain the evolution of many species when you have many millions of years to do it in. Lake Victoria, though, dried up, basically only in the Pleistocene, so thousands of years ago. And there was rivers kind of draining through the area. The rivers didn't totally dry up, but the lake went away. And there were just a few river species during this period of time. So it's a spectacular biological story. Climate change, the lake filled up again, and in just thousands of years, 600 species of fish evolved in Lake Victoria. So this is the story of the adaptive radiation of African cichlid fish. There's about 2,000 species of cichlids, etc., and the radiations took different amounts of time. This one in Lake Victoria that we'll focus on now, these words will make sense to the biologists, I hope. It's the highest known sustained rate of diversification of any vertebrate, which means of anything that has a backbone on Earth, there's a more rapid explosion of species in the Lake Victoria fish than any other line of vertebrates that we know of. So, spectacular biological story, tremendous amount of biodiversity. For some ecological reasons, it makes sense. Some other kind of mysterious things going on scientifically. There's Lake Victoria again. Turns out it's the second largest lake by area. There are no large river inflows. There are many small ones. It is the source of the Nile. It's relatively shallow, 84 meters. That makes it sensitive to climate change. And now we'll talk about the fish and we'll talk about the people around Lake Victoria. So the fisheries of Lake Victoria, all these many, many species of cichlids, those fish have contributed to the livelihood of many people for many years. But the fish story has changed in recent times. So fish have always been important, but in different ways. Let's talk about that story. So those little colorful African cichlids are inches long. In the 1950s, through circumstances that are a little bit murky, this fish was introduced to Lake Victoria. This is what we call the Nile perch. To my knowledge, no one has ever definitively determined how Nile perch got into Lake Victoria. Ugandan Fisheries Bureau was thinking about introducing Nile perch to Lake Victoria. They were actually raising it on the shores of the lake in holding facilities. The fish appeared in the lake. But there's no record of a sort of direct governmental decision or anything to make that happen. Anyway, it appeared. And as you can imagine, a bunch of fish this big are, breakfast for the Nile perch. And the fish, Nile perch, became more and more and more abundant, and really the populations exploded in the 1980s. And when I first started hearing about this story, Nile perch were being blamed for almost everything that was going wrong in Lake Victoria. This was thought to be a great extirpation of species. Today, maybe we're a little less alarmed in the sense that some of the species that we thought went extinct, they're actually still present in low numbers. And now we also fully understand there's a lot more also going on in Lake Victoria. So we'll talk about that, but we can't blame everything that's going wrong in Lake Victoria on this one species. It's still an important story. So the population of this piscivore, this fish-eating fish, exploded in the 80s, and it's declining now. Now, the little fish, the little colorful ones that evolved in the lake, were important to the people around the shores of this lake in the following way. There was a community around Lake Victoria who would wade out in the lake waters with small nets, and they would net up these small cichlid fish, bring them on shore, put them on rocks, and dry them, and then they would consume those. So the people surrounding Lake Victoria used the lake as an important source of protein, and we would probably today call that a sustainable fisheries. This thing, of course, you don't catch with a small net wading out from shore. And the reason anyone was even contemplating stocking this fish in the first place is you can produce a really valuable commercial fishery with Nile perch. You can make money catching Nile perch. You can't make money drying little fish on rocks. You may be able to get lunch from little fish dried on rocks, but you can't make money. You can make a lot of money if you make a lot of these fish. And the whole economy, the whole sociology of the region changed. So here's Nile perch over time. This is actually global statistics, not just Lake Victoria, but they're basically mirror images. Nile perch exploding in the 80s, kind of leveling off, and then, as you can see, starting in 2005 maybe, declining. That decline's important too. So over the explosion time from the 50s into the 2000s, now the lake's fisheries changed from drying small fish on rocks to big boats, processing plants on shore, basically an economic stratification with corporations involved and harvesting of the fish. And now the people around Lake Victoria actually can make a living. There are jobs with hard currency, which didn't exist before, but there's really no fish left to net and eat. So the whole economy of the region changed from sustainable to very dependent on these commercial enterprises. The processing plants are there, buying fish from the boats, filleting them, putting those fillets on ice, putting those on airplanes, and flying them to Europe. So a lot of hard currencies coming into the country because they're selling Nile perch to Europe, but of course the protein's going out of the country. The whole relationship of people to lake has changed because of this one species of fish. Here's the human density around Lake Victoria over time, with the redder colors meaning more people. And of course, the population is growing in this part of the world all the time, but you can argue, I think convincingly, that at least some of that demographic change in the human population was because of the fish. There were jobs there that didn't used to exist. If you have no way of making a living, you'll go a long way to get a job. And people were importing into the watershed because they could get a job on a fishing boat or in the processing plant. So this drew people to the region. A bunch of words up here. You won't read probably any of them. This is basically saying that, kind of describing the situation at the peak of the Nile perch fishing. It says by the end of 2006, there were an estimated 200,000 fishermen operating 65,000 boats engaged in Nile perch fishing on Tanzania's side alone. Up in the upper right, more than 180 tons of fresh Nile perch were processed daily, ready to be exported to Europe. EU countries were consuming 80% of the total Nile perch fillet from the lake. The value of annual exports of Nile perch fillet rose from 0 to above 180 million. At the airport, an average of 5 cargo planes with a capacity of 100 tons were waiting to fly a Nile perch fillet to Europe every week. One fish species has basically done all this. So now I have a question for you. What will happen with a commercially valuable fisheries that is completely unregulated? Overfishing. Thank you. So here we are today. And now the disappearance of Nile perch is a disaster. All these people have moved to the shoreline. There were jobs. The boats aren't catching fish. The economy's depressed. So at one time, Nile perch was the evil species that's wrecking Lake Victoria. Today it's going away, and it's another kind of story about human suffering. All around one fish in one lake. There's lots of other things going on in Lake Victoria, lots of other things to worry about, I'm sorry to say. Another invasive species has entered the scene in Lake Victoria. This is water hyacinth, which was probably introduced because it's a valuable ornamental. People like it in their backyard ponds and stuff. And water hyacinth likes Lake Victoria. So there are places on the shore of Lake Victoria which look like this, which basically means that with the wind blowing in the right direction, people who used to be able to get small boats out to try to catch some fish to live on today, they can't even get to the lake waters anymore because of the tremendous populations of water hyacinth. Water hyacinth is growing very well there, in part because of all the nutrients that all those people have brought to the system. So it's all connected in a way. And really, we're still just talking about one lake and one fish in some ways. So it's not just the water. I've emphasized how much water there is in these places, how valuable the water is. Of course, that's all true. But these systems are biological systems. We depend on them for lots of things. And I don't know of a better story than the Lake Victoria one to talk about our relationship with nature. So, next little story. Water resources and demand around the globe. So the map has to do with the sort of amount of water on the landscape. We don't have to dwell on that. The table, that's very hard to read, is about different countries. And at the upper part of this table, we have Norway, Brazil, Canada, and Sweden. And they're in a group of countries that we consider to have a low withdrawal ratio. That means the percent of renewable water in those countries that is taken out of rivers, out of lakes, that's used for humans is very low, a low withdrawal ratio. Norway, 0.6% of renewable water enters into the human economy in some way. Brazil, 0.8, Canada and Sweden, both 1.7. The middle countries have medium withdrawal ratios. Poland, China, U.S., South Africa, and India, 20 to 30% withdrawal ratio. The bottom countries are, of course, the ones that have the highest withdrawal ratio: Israel, Egypt, Libya, Kuwait. I'll read the numbers to you. 108% of renewable water withdrawn by Israel, 127 by Egypt, 800 by Libya, 3,000 by Kuwait. Of course, that's not, you have to get water from somewhere. If you're withdrawing 3,000% of your available water, you must be getting water from some other source, and that's what's happening. The point I want to make here is there's water rich and there's water poor, and the difference couldn't be wider. When we talk about water rich, we mean really water rich. We mean using less than 1% of what's available. When we talk about water poor, we mean really water poor, using more than you have available to you in your immediate surroundings. That's country by country. Here's what's happening in the U.S. today. So this was as of March 31, 2005, the U.S. Drought Monitor. This is updated very regularly. I'm sure everyone has been reading stories about the drought in southwest U.S. And even in our Great Lakes region, which we overall would consider water rich, you see there's some drought even in our region with groundwater depletion and other things like that, which has actually been topic of lectures in this series. So water rich and water poor within a single country. And it seems like every conversation I get in right now, people are saying, well, what's going on with this business about trying to pipe water from the Great Lakes to California? And there is a very strong political agreement among the U.S. states and the Canadian provinces not to do that. There's something called the Compact, Great Lakes Compact, that says no one can do that without the permission of everyone else in the agreement, which is every other Great Lakes state and the provinces. It's a very strong political agreement. But it is a political agreement, right? And if we've made one agreement, we could make another one. And I just want to say, I'm not trying to, scare anyone. This isn't going to happen tomorrow. What happens if food prices go up by 5-fold? What happens if we can't get lettuce in the winter? There will be pressure placed on resolving this water poor, water rich situation within our own country, within the continent of North America. Water rich, water poor. We're really struggling with this. What does this mean? We don't really price water the way markets do. It seems overabundant, and your water bill that you pay every month has almost nothing to do with the cost of getting it and what it's really, we're struggling with this. This is a really important topic for scholars to work on. Water rich, water poor. Next story. So every now and then I keep running into these amazing statistics about sizes of these systems, and this is one I just ran into recently. Here's miles of coastline. Lake Superior, this is U.S., apologies to the Canadian consulate. Miles of coastline on the U.S. side of Lake Superior, turns out that's 1,200 miles. Lake Michigan, 1,600. Lake Huron, 800. Lake Erie, 400. Lake Ontario, 300, for a total of 4,530 miles of coastline on the U.S. side of the Great Lakes. Let's compare that to the Pacific coast. 1,300. There's almost 4 times as much coast on the U.S. side of the Great Lakes as the Pacific U.S. coastline. The Atlantic, 2,170. It's almost twice as much coastline in the Great Lakes as the Atlantic. The Gulf of Mexico, 1,630. You have to almost add up all of those marine coasts to equal the Great Lakes. They do exceed the Great Lakes by a little bit. So I've heard the Great Lakes coastline referred to as, what, the third coast or something like that? Fourth coast. The heck with that. It's the first coast. It's the biggest one. And if you figure it's people interacting along these shorelines, I didn't really know that until recently. I was like, what? I didn't know that. It changes how you think. These systems are ginormous. This is an image from just days ago, believe it or not. A nice cloudless day across the Great Lakes Basin. It might have been a few weeks. It wasn't that long ago. Snow melting from south to north. Still a lot of ice in that day on Lake Superior, even northern Lake Michigan. The parts of Lake Huron still frozen up. While at the same time, western Lake Erie is undergoing an algal bloom. Can you see that from your seat? The green of western Lake Erie? That's algae. Saginaw Bay, that little blippy thing pointing at me in Lake Huron, that's an algal bloom in Saginaw Bay. The little white stuff at the very southern tip of Lake Michigan, that's sediment being resuspended from Lake Michigan. So in one moment of time, we've got all that going on in the system. And that is one of the hugest scientific challenges I've ever tried to deal with in my life. How do we come to understand this gigantic system that is doing all these things at once? And it's all tied together. That is a really fun, fascinating, but challenging scientific problem. Let's just play around a little bit more with the scale of these systems. So here's Lake Superior, 350 miles across. So I had fun with a calculator one day. Speed of sound's 350 meters per second. So it turns out if you're, let's say, in Duluth, where I was last night, and you yell really loud, they would hear you in Sault Ste. Marie on the other side of the lake in 27 minutes. One body of water. This is a fun story. This is the largest boat, largest ship, vessel on the Great Lakes. It's one of the Lakers that carries iron ore from Minnesota and Michigan down lake to the mills of Chicago, Indiana, Pennsylvania. This is the Tregurtha, 1,013 feet long. Now, last night I asked this in Duluth, and somebody knew. Does anybody here know how deep the deepest spot of Lake Superior is in feet? Don does. That's very, yeah, it's about 1,400. That's close enough. The deepest spot of Lake Superior, 1,400 feet, this is 1,000 feet. So now what I want you to do mentally, most of you have seen Lake Superior, its vastness, and a little oar boat out there. I want you in your mind, take that little boat, tip it, and think, that's how deep the lake is. That changes how you think. The ratio of width to depth is, or other way around, depth to width is a very, very tiny number of Lake Superior. Similar to the thickness to breadth of a sheet of notebook paper. So if you want to have a good 3D map of Lake Superior, 3D model of Lake Superior, accurate in all dimensions, take a piece of notebook paper and cut it out. This is one of Earth's deepest lakes. These systems are fascinating in their magnitude of all kinds, but our brains mentally completely mess us up in thinking about depth. They're not bowls. They're more like saucers or even less. How does that change how we think? They're so much more exposed to the air. They're so much more vulnerable in my mind when they're just a thin film of water than if they're a bowl. That's not science. It's just psychology. But it changes how you think. So I want you to think about the world this way instead of the way you came in with. Some years ago, some scientists calculated how much water the whole human enterprise uses in a year. And they did this through a complicated series of calculations. I won't show you any of them. This is just the result. So that column over there, ET co-opted in cubic kilometers, that's the amount of water evaporating off of all the cultivated land on Earth. Turns out that's 5,500 in a year. Grazing land about the same, about 5,000 cubic kilometers. Forests about the same. Human-occupied areas, a much smaller number. The total amount of water running through what I call the human enterprise, all of the crops we grow, all the fiber that we grow, all of that. The total amount of water running human society in a year is about 18,000 cubic kilometers. That's 1.5 Lake Superiors. So when I'm giving lectures on the shore of the lake, I say, look out. That's how much water humans need in a year. Right there, you're looking at it. Roughly 1.5. Okay, let's call it 1. Now, is that a lot of water? Is it a little water? I don't know the answer to that, but you can visualize it. It takes 1 Lake Superior to run all of humanity for a year. So let's come back to this topic of value. Which would you pay more for, a glass of water or that magnificent gem? The water's free, practically. The gem has no use in our life at all. But we have use value. Water couldn't be more valuable in terms of use. And then we have exchange value in the world's economy. Pulling these things together in some sensible way is one of the challenges of our time. Here's a fun calculation. So if you go to the gas station and you get a bottle of water, I'm just going to use round numbers. Let's say that water costs you $1 a liter. It's a nice round number. It's easy to calculate at 1 times something. At that price, Lake Superior is worth 100 times the annual gross world product. And you could drink it, and in most places in the lake, you could drink that water. Of course, that's a senseless calculation. Nobody could pay it. So it couldn't be worth that because there's no one who could afford it. So an economist would skewer me over this calculation. But that's okay, I'm a biologist. The point is how we value things. Is Lake Superior worth 100 times the world economy? It's pretty valuable, though. The Great Lakes region in general is an amazing economic engine. And the Great Lakes region is here because of the Great Lakes. So we're cheating a little bit here. We're saying all of the economy in all of the states and provinces that border the Great Lakes. And we're looking at that. So not all of it's directly tied to the water, but surely the water has as much to do with this region as anything else. If we add up the economies of all these states plus Ontario, it's a gross domestic product of $4.7 trillion, 98 million people. That's 28% of the Canadian and U.S. economic activity. It's 46 million jobs. It's 29% of the Canadian and U.S. workforce. And it's more than half of the Canada-U.S. cross-border trade in this region defined by these lakes. In fact, the Great Lakes region is the 4th largest world economy. And we're here because of the lakes, really. That's why we settled this. That's the economic engine of any one thing. That's the engine. A little more careful analysis here, trying to separate out things that we can directly tie to the lakes themselves and the economy. This one study said that more than 1.5 million jobs and $62 billion in wages is directly tied to the Great Lakes. Have they shaped our lives? I mean, come on. They almost are our life in a lot of ways. So my point for you in all of this is this struggle to define water rich. It's making us rich. We're not valuing it in a way that seems sensible. we've got to do something about this. I don't know the answer, but it's, as I've been saying, it's one of the great challenges of our time. Tiny bit more science. This is a figure I put together with some physics friends not long ago. So this is a diagram of scales. And at the upper left, we have small spatial and temporal scales. We have 1 second and we have 1 millimeter. And the little blob up there is identifying the physical processes that are associated with 1 second and 1 millimeter. Tiny things happening in very tiny volumes of water, and it's diffusion and molecular processes. And then as we go to the right and as we go down, we're lengthening spatial and temporal scales, and we finally get all the way up to the size of the world's oceans in the bottom right, with gyre circulation and regional climate. Then there's this whole range of things in between. It turns out that, and this is maybe the deepest science point I have for you, it turns out that these huge lakes aren't just big versions of small lakes. We'll never understand the big lakes by taking small lakes and just multiplying by lots of numbers to scale up. The reason is things happen at big scale that don't happen at small scale. Once we make a big system, new things are happening that don't ever happen in any meaningful way in small scale. Tides, processes called surfacaceous. These are the waves that are periodic and they bring water up and bring water down. Coastally trapped waves, eddies. These things are characteristic of these really big water bodies. They're challenging, they're heterogeneous, they're expensive, and we'll never understand them unless we look at them. We need to look at these systems by themselves, not just scaling up. Here's a lovely picture of Western Lake Erie. That's one of the algal blooms that is a regular occurrence there anymore. I actually wanted to show you those lovely swirls of algae that grew in Western Lake Erie, and they're being transported to the east and north. Those features are larger than most lakes on Earth. So that's a visual of what I say. We need to look at these big systems of their own right. You don't see these gigantic features in small water bodies. How could we understand Lake Erie without incorporating what we can understand about these big scale features? This is the science kind of challenge that we try to deal with. So we'll talk a little bit about this algal bloom. It's in the news all the time. I bet many of you remember or heard about last summer. The city of Toledo had to shut down their water supply for a few days. It was an algal bloom like this one. It actually was a very localized one. The wind was blowing in just the right direction that a relatively smallish algal bloom shut down the water supply because it was sitting right over the water intake of Toledo. These algal blooms are a relatively, so the long history of this is Lake Erie was experiencing many very large algal blooms in the 50s and 60s, and then partly because of Lake Erie, the Clean Water Act came along and we reduced phosphorus inputs to these lakes, and the lake got cleaner, and it seemed like the problem was fixed, more or less. I mean, there's other things going on. Now recently we're hearing about algal blooms in Lake Erie again. What's going on? Is the lake dirtier again? Well, here is the best calculation I've seen to date of the phosphorus, that's the key limiting substance, going into Lake Erie over time. We're in the 50s, or actually 60s, and then it drops. That's policy. That's the Clean Water Act and social investment, cleaning up the inputs of phosphorus to Lake Erie. Then it levels off for a long time. For some reason, it's in these recent years we're seeing the problem come back. It is not as simple as, well, we got lazy and we started adding nutrients again. We're adding just as much of the limiting nutrient today as we were in the 80s and 90s when there weren't algal blooms, or they were much smaller. We're still trying to sort that out. What's going on? There's something a little more complicated than simple dose response going on here. That's because there's a lot of biology going on here, a lot of the biogeochemistry that I love, These things kind of have a mind of their own. We understand the basic problem, but year to year, what's driving, whether you have a lot of algae or not, that's a much more challenging problem. So my message is there's more and more science mysteries of all these kinds. This is what gets me up in the morning, trying to deal with these things. So we're almost done. We as a people, as governments, as a collective, we are investing tremendous amount of money in the Great Lakes today through an initiative called the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, the GLRI. It's money coming from the federal government, and as of a few months ago when I made this slide, 2,000 projects were supported across the whole Great Lakes region on the shorelines, rehabilitating and restoring coastlines, cleaning things up, improving the environment around the Great Lakes, creating wildlife habitat where it used to exist. Lots of good work going on. $1.1 billion invested so far. Well, it turns out, and this is, I'm being very self-centered, self-serving in telling you this right now, but as a member of the community of scientists who are studying the offshore of these lakes, we feel very underfunded. We really, and we could talk about this later, I can give you facts and figures, we're dealing with really a trickle of funding when there is $1 billion having been invested in ecological restoration. I am not against ecological restoration. But I feel, and what I'm trying to do partly today is explain to you that there's a lot of important science that can be done, and we really need public support. We need you to help us, either through influence on the government, direct contributions, whatever you can do. We need more science to help us understand these things. So I'm going to close with this. The geopolitics was mentioned. We've talked a little bit about that. Out at the reception, I got into a couple conversations where people were talking about water wars and conflict over water. It happens. Here's some headlines. Gaza residents suffering from severe water shortage due to conflict. And if you want to take over a people, one of the quickest way to do it is shut off their water. What can Iraq's fight over the Mosul Dam tell us about water security? Ukraine-Russia conflict results in, quote, water war. 3 international water conflicts to watch. Now here's, to me, a fascinating point. I read this in a speech that was delivered to the UN by a Saudi prince. And in that speech, the Saudi prince said the following: out of 148 countries in the world that share transboundary water resources, no 2 countries that share deep policy-level collaboration on water have ever gone to war. You could say, it's kind of a chicken and egg problem, but you could say that if we can cooperate on water, we can survive peacefully. There are 37 countries, largely in the Middle East, that don't have any collaboration on water. Needless to say, these are the countries that are the greatest risk of war. So there is a very strong relationship between the way we interact with each other about water and our level of peaceful interaction. Being water rich carries responsibilities. World peace, you name it. So, I like this one. This is me. I'm a limnologist, the study of inland waters. I hope I've made the topic relevant to you today. The take-homes, the handful of dimples. Discovery continues. Positive story. We are in control. There's no subjugating. There's no saying, it's not my problem. No, it's all our problem. It's not just the water. Water rich, water poor. What does that mean? How do we relate to that? And we're struggling to define water rich. More and more science mysteries. And being water rich carries responsibilities. So, thank you. This is what I do now, the Large Lakes Observatory at the University of Minnesota Duluth. I'd love to interact with you. If you have questions, if you want to talk to me, There's my email address. I have a license to kill. The University of Minnesota gave that to me. Stern 007. I didn't ask for that, but when they gave it to me, I said, I'll take it. And I'm on Twitter at Bob Sterner. Thank you very much.
Terrific, Bob. Thanks a lot for that. I think the routine here is the speakers are going to, or the panelists are going to come up to the table. As we get settled here, I was going to read some bios on the speakers. I want to say it's always a pleasure to help host these events and discussions, especially so having one of our own back here on campus. Thanks again for joining us tonight, Bob. That was really a great talk. I wanted to also remind you that these were some really terrific data-rich slides, a lot of wonderful points made, and they're all online and available for you to revisit if some of those numbers are things you'd like to remember. For me, that 5 lakes, half the world's water supply is pretty impressive number. I'm interested to hear more about We Are in Control.
Sure. Yeah.
So you want to join me over here and have a seat? Yeah, I'm going to stand. So as I introduce them, if you have more thought questions that come to mind, please jot them down, and there are folks in the aisles here that can hand out more sheets for you to write on. So I'm going to go from the far end this way with our first panelist, Raj Ranjan. He's the vice president of R&D at the Echo Labs, where he is the lead technical person in introducing sustainability into the company's adventures. He received his PhD in the environmental engineering from the University of Massachusetts and has a BS in civil engineering from the IIT Varanasi in India. Thanks for being with us today. And I'm going to go through their introductions and then just ask them all to sort of make general comments about Bob's presentation this evening, so you can be thinking about that. Okay. Our next guest is, and I hope I have the right order here. No, I don't. I'm out of order here, so I'm going to just skip over the general counsel there and talk about Chris Larson. He's the executive director for the Minnesota Land Trust, where he has worked in various capacities since 1998. The Minnesota Land Trust is a statewide nonprofit organization with a mission to protect and restore Minnesota's most vital natural lands. From 2003 to 2006, Mr. Larson served as the executive director of the Colorado Coalition of Land Trusts based in Denver, where he oversaw program delivery to more than 60 land trust and local government conservation programs. Prior to 1998, he worked in the Brandywine Conservancy in Pennsylvania, which is a regional conservation organization that specializes in implementing innovative land use techniques to protect land, water, and cultural heritage in the Brandywine Valley. Mr. Larson has a master's in landscape architecture from the University of Georgia's School of Environmental Design and a bachelor's degree from Carleton College. He lives in Duluth with his wife and 2 children. Jamsed Merchant began serving as Canada's General Counsel in Minneapolis. Consul General, in Minneapolis in October 2012. He is Canada's senior representative in the upper Midwest states of Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, North Dakota, and South Dakota. Jamsed started his career as a faculty lecturer in the geography at McGill University in Montreal in 1979. In 1983, he joined the Alberta government's Ministry of the Environment as a soil scientist working on land reclamation. And then from 1985 to 2001, Jamsed worked with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada as a soil conservationist in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Between 2003 and 2007, Jamsted worked with the Treasury Board of Canada's Secretariat. He returned to Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in 2007 and was appointed Assistant Deputy Minister of Agriculture and Environment Services Branch in 2008. Jamsted graduated from the University of East Anglia in 1977 with a degree in environmental science and received his master's in pedology and soil survey at the University of Reading in 1978. So with that, we'll begin with Raj at the end. Do you have some reflections on Bob's comments tonight?
Sure. I have to start off with something personal. I keep thinking about Lake Superior when you were talking, and I thought 30 years ago, literally 6 months after I came to the U.S., I was backcountry camping on Isle Royal and portaging a canoe, and I still remember this was, of course, pre-Twitter days, writing a postcard to my mom saying I'm camping on the largest island, on the largest lake, on the largest island, on the largest lake in the world. And the terrible thing is, I can't jump into the water because it's full of leeches. So that is my recollection of biology. And
You could have jumped in the water.
I was too scared of leeches. But it's been for me personally, it's been a phenomenal journey around water. Right, I was, and Mr. Merchant can relate to this. I was first 2 decades of my life I spent in South Asia, where from kindergarten we learned that the wettest place on earth is in northeastern India, a place called Cherrapunji, where for about 5 months a year, women, and it's almost always women and girls, have to walk several kilometers to get the basic necessity of water for them to cook and drink at home because of the seasonality of water and the enormous dependence we as humans have on infrastructure to store and extract water so that we can use it. And so there's the wettest place on earth where people really spend almost half their life searching for water and bringing it home. 2, Minnesota, where when I heard the story about that lake that has, I bet every one of you cringed. I know I did when I heard someone poking a hole into a lake that has water that's 20 million years old. And all I could think of was, here we are in the greater MSP region where water tables are dropping, and you look at where that water got there, when it got there, and I've read stories about it being 19 to 20 million years old. So we are watering our lawns with sprinkler systems that is using water that got into this water table 20 million years ago, and we are not cringing. So there's the contrast, right? It's a contrast between Kazakhstan and California. Here we are in California where we are growing rice, and the neighboring vegetable or almond farm, which did not get grandfathered into the water rights, is sitting dry. Fruits, nuts, and vegetables generate 100 to 1,000 times the economic value and nutritional value that rice generates. However, the rice farmers got grandfathered into their water rights, and they're able to continue growing rice, watering the desert just like the people dried the Aral Sea trying to grow cotton. And then I think about the movement of water that you talked about. Talked about John Kennedy, President Kennedy, but it goes back to the Tennessee Valley Authority. And it's no different than what the Romans did. When Rome ran out of water, they built aqueducts. They moved water from all over the world into Rome, all over the empire. Now, today in California, Northern California, from the Sacramento River Basin, does not want to send water to Southern California. And the reason is not to protect water for human use, but reason is to protect water for aquatic life. Which is fascinating, right? There is awareness. There is a bright side of the story. However, on the other side of the world, China is trying to move water from southern China to northern China because all the water is in the south and all the coal is in the north. And guess what? Outside of agriculture, we use most of the water for electric power generation. And it's not just coal. We say nuclear is one of the all of the above options to get away from carbon emissions. Nuclear power withdraws more fresh water. And then we say, well, things get better. And I work for Ecolab, where we work at the nexus of water and food, not as much in the production, but in the food processing. We work at the nexus of water and energy, to some extent on the production side, but more on the demand side. There is a lot more tight nexus between water and energy on the use and demand side. And we worked at the nexus of water and health. And every one of these, food security, energy availability and cost, and public health, are all huge vulnerabilities associated with climate change. So we're not only going to have the direct impact of water availability itself, but all these other aspects that are so critical to the quality of human life that are impacted by the water. And I was fascinated hearing your story, and I'm just trying to visualize this piece of paper and cutting out the Great Lake map. And I'm thinking, I did a pie chart. I always present pie charts similar to the ones you did, except I'm thinking not about the 50% of the fresh water that's in lakes, but about the less than 1% that's in rivers. Rivers account for 2 out of every million gallons of water on planet Earth. And still, almost all of human civilization is totally dependent on rivers, which in my mind, in a very simplistic term, is the only renewable, sustainable source of water because it's replenished by nature practically every rainy season. The big challenge we have in the world today, if we look at it from a bright or glass almost full perspective, is our water challenges will disappear overnight if we address our energy challenge. Because it's interesting that almost every talk I go to on water, the audience, over 90% of the questions that come up is, what about desalination? Everybody is thirsty for the magic bullet. And the best thing I've heard is our Chief Technology Officer, Larry Berger, saying, yeah, they do it. They do it in Saudi Arabia. They do it in the Middle East. They do it because their energy is free. But we could all do it. We would all be able to drink water. We won't be able to breathe if we use that source of energy that is available widely today. So that is the big challenge, right? So those are some of the thoughts that came out when I heard a lot of the things that he said, and we're looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Consulate General Merchant.
Great, thank you very much. So just 2 points to follow up from what you talked about. You talked about the amount of water and the miles of lakeshore that the Great Lakes have. If you think about Canada and the United States, our shared border, it's the world's longest border, it's the world's longest unprotected border, the friendliest border, 5,500 miles. Does anyone know how much of that 5,500 miles is actually water? Anyone have a guess?
1,000?
Yeah, well, 43%, almost half that boundary. So almost 2,500 miles is water. The Great Lakes, of course, form a big chunk of it. But so water is a huge part, and we kind of you touched on it, but really we're looking at interjurisdictional management of water resources. But you look at those 10 Great Lakes, the majority of them were shared by people, right? And so I'll get to that later. Then the other interesting quote you had on your slide, Stephen, was about the Saudi prince and talking about sort of when you look at the world, how the countries that are peaceful. Well, what's the thing? It was quite remarkable.
So the countries that share deep policy connection on water, whatever that means, none of them have ever gone to war.
So with that, I'm going to ask you, do you know when the first agreement on water management was made? Anyone know? Anyone have a guess? Well, I'll tell you, it was in 1909. It was between Canada and the United States with the Boundary Waters Agreement. That was the very first agreement between two countries on managing water. From that time on, so 105 years, that is the number one first environmental agreement between two countries that ever existed. Since that time, you can follow its legacy all the way down to today and into what you managed. You talked about the Great Lakes Compact. So, and it's really true. So Canada and the United States, we haven't actually gone to war for 200 years. So it gets to the other point that I think is really fundamentally important to me. I'm a soil conservationist. I headed up before I came here, in the United States, there's something called the Natural Resources Conservation Service. I was the head of the Canadian equivalent. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out, how do you help people change? How do you help people change their practices? How do you help them change their relationship with the environment, but in a way that's sustainable for the environment, but also in a way that's sustainable for their livelihoods, for their social structures and their economies. And one of the things you really learn in doing that is that you need really strong, you need people to get involved together. You need governance, institutional governance. You need people at all levels, from prime ministers and presidents all the way down to local communities at watershed levels, working together to plan and work together, because it's not easy, because everyone has different sort of needs for water. So when we're looking at water in large lakes, one of the primary pieces in all of this, through all of this, is us, ourselves, human beings, and our relationship to that water. How do we collectively manage that? On the large lakes, it's even more complicated, because if you just think of the slide of Lake Victoria. You had Kenya, you had Tanzania, and I think you had Uganda, right? You had 3 countries. Now, they're struggling to develop their own structures, their own governance to make a go of it. Can you imagine how difficult it is for them to develop sort of common management of the Lake Victoria system? It's hard enough in North America, right? And as Stephen mentioned, it's going to come to the day when people will want to draw water from the Great Lakes, right? And it'll be interesting to see the political challenges there. So really, we need, as human beings, need to look at that. And the other part of it, one of the other large lakes in the world, which wasn't mentioned, Lake Winnipeg, Lake Manitoba, which is a system, again, just straight north of us here in the Twin Cities. There's an interesting thing, because Lake Winnipeg is getting going through the eutrophication, algal blooms. This is just as much as you see in Lake Erie and Lake Huron. One of the interesting facts is a lot of the materials causing that, nutrients causing that, not only comes in from Canada, which a lot of it does, coming in from the west of Canada, the Canadian prairies, from agriculture and other things, but it's also coming in from places like Minnesota and North Dakota. So there you had to think about, how do governments, how do organizations, how do jurisdictions work together to save a lake or save a water resource that's not even in your own country? So how do you help citizens in another jurisdiction work towards that? So when you're thinking about all these issues, they're critically important, but in the end, it is about us. You have to think about what we can do as individuals, what our governments can do together. There's huge, really good examples. And Canada and the United States, through the Boundary Waters Treaties Agreement and everything that's come through it, everything that's come since on environmental issues, it's all followed the same model, working together to solve problems, understanding what the issue is, understanding the science, developing solutions, the technologies put into place, and developing the regulations and laws and the policy instruments to do that. Those are some of the critical pieces, having the right science, understanding it, being able to then develop the right technologies, and then having the right policy instruments. That is of critical importance. You see that being discussed actually just now, every day, just now in Minnesota, as the state legislature, as the governor talk about water quality in Minnesota and how to tackle that. Having the right policy instruments is a crucial part of the equation, and they're very varied all the way from market forces to riparian strips, all sorts of things. But it's being able to understand what are those tools, and then finally we have to do it in a way that actually helps people. This is not about putting people out of work. It's not about laying people off, because politically you just can't do that. In most countries, that's sort of if you want to stay in government for a long time, you want to make people happy. So we have to find solutions, technologies that are win-win. We have to find ways that make that change, but at the same time help societies, communities, small towns, large towns, farmers, businesses, maintain in business, be profitable. So that's the challenge, developing the technologies, the policy approaches to move that forward. It's not difficult, it's not easy, it's very difficult, but it really is, it's really about us and working together to make that difference.
Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, thank you, and I really appreciate this discussion. I was fortunate enough back in 91, 92 to work at a place called the Lake Superior Center. Some of you know that was the precursor to the Great Lakes Aquarium in the city of Duluth. And at that time, they were helping to start the Binational Forum and do a lot of work around policy issues around the Great Lakes. And the interesting thing is, looking back now 25 years, some things have changed dramatically and others haven't changed at all. And I think that's one of the reasons I think I was asked to be on the panel, is to talk about some of the things that are happening and some of the on-the-ground work that the Minnesota Land Trust is involved in, DNR, PCA, and others in this room. But I think one of the things that still fascinates me, even today, that isn't all that different, is we always, when I worked at the Lake Superior Center, we would ask people what 5 states bordered Minnesota. And so you would always get people thinking North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, Wisconsin, and they would scrunch, Ontario? You know, they would ask. And it's Michigan, of course, because our state boundary goes all the way out into Lake Superior. And even to this day, we ask that question at different forums, and nobody gets it, you know. So I think if anything else, my take-home, again, is reminding Minnesota and all of us in this room, we are a Great Lakes state, and we have a seat at the table, and we don't always use that seat as effectively as we could as a state, whether it's our state or federal policy. I was also very fortunate back then to paddle all the way around Lake Superior with Craig Blacklock, who was doing his book on Lake Superior images at that time. So I have a kind of a unique perspective of understanding the lake, not only from the water policy perspective, but from its beauty and its kind of power and its place that many of the lakes today don't have anymore. If you saw the lake of Lake Victoria and all the people surrounding that, a lot of the natural environment and some of the other things that make it great have been diminished as a result of some of our choices. I wanted to key in on one thing, though, that you spoke to, Dr. Sterner, and that is, I think the quote was, it's a positive story about people, and you had several good examples there. And I think, for me, if there's one place to spend a little bit of time, it's trying to think about where are those positive stories about people making a change, and at what level is that change likely to happen. And I think many of you know the story about what's happening in the St. Louis River estuary, but some don't, and it's part of that $1.1 billion that isn't going enough to science, I know that. But it is a great story because it's a Minnesota story as well, and that is taking what was once one of the largest wetlands in the whole Great Lakes system, the St. Louis River, some 14,000 acres. If you think about taking Lake Minnetonka and plugging it next to Duluth, that's the scale we're talking about. And obviously through years of decay and impact, both from just a terrestrial side of life, what we did to the shoreline, but also obviously with industry, the power of that place diminished dramatically. And to the point of which, if you lived in the city of Duluth like I did growing up, you never went there. It was a place you didn't even think about going, was to the river. Where today, many of the investments that the Minnesota Land Trust is involved in, and many others, is looking at taking resources both from the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, but we're so fortunate in Minnesota with the Clean Water Fund and Outdoor Heritage Fund to be able to have resources to be able to looking at cleaning up that system to a point. Not only will it be good for the aquatic habitat, which is a big part of the focus, not only will it be better for clean water, but I think one of the most important aspects of that, it's going to reconnect people to that resource again, because people haven't been using it for really 100 years. And so when we think about making that connection, the positive story of people, I think efforts like that are important from all kinds of policy perspectives and important from just our public health, but I think it's for that investment in people in the long term. And with the Land Trust, we talk about perpetuity. We do conservation work that lasts forever. And so we also recognize not only do we do great on-the-ground conservation work and implement that, not only do work on restoration, but we need to make an investment in people in the long term, make sure that people in 30, 40, 70 years still care about whether it's water or whatever our natural resources are. And I think the story of Duluth is a good example where the goal of the St. Louis River Restoration Initiative isn't just about the water, it's about place and recognizing how important that system is to the city of Duluth. And as many of you have heard, the mayor has made a major investment in West Duluth to really rehabilitate that area through the natural environment and through outdoor recreation in a very different way, in a very different script than has happened before. And that's important on a number of levels just for the city, but what it tells me is where is the likely source of change going to happen? It can happen at all kinds of levels, but I think a lot of cities are going to be the driver of change on many of these conversations. We've seen that with the city of Des Moines now suing upstream neighbors. And so if we're looking at inspiration and stories that we can use on a broader level, I would look at those on-the-ground implementation areas like the St. Louis River Restoration Initiative, like the city of Duluth, and other things that we have right here in Minnesota that can be stories, I think, for elsewhere as we're looking on the broader field. So that's what I have to say. Thanks.
So after all that, any reflections on their comments you want to comment on?
Comment on the comment?
Very meta here.
It's like a mirror. Right?
Well, I nodded a lot. I think those are all good points.
So he's not nodding off.
Policy is important, obviously. That's the instrument where we affect change. And local, I completely harmonize with the thought that it's the local units that are the ones that are making a difference now. I've talked to quite a few mayors around the Great Lakes. There's some spectacular stories about people doing things in their communities. Last night I also I gave this talk in Duluth, and I ended up sitting down next to a couple, retired couple, who had just written a book a couple years ago. They had walked around Lake Superior. And the one thing they said that they learned, the biggest thing they learned was you go from community to community to community, and community A doesn't know what community B is doing. They're solving the same problems. You say, what's going on here? Well, we have this thing going on. And they would say, well, have you talked to the people right over here? No, I didn't know they were doing that. And so, I think all of this stuff's true, and it's how we make a difference and how we affect change at a local level, but also how we glue all that together in a way that we move forward efficiently, learning from each other's experiences, and just take the best care that we can of these precious resources.
I was wondering, in thinking about the sort of the tightening of the federal dollars towards research in particular, and sort of a push for all of us to think more about philanthropic contributions to address some of the world's problems, what your experiences have been with respect to donors being interested in this area. Maybe,
So I'll give you one comment, right? Ecolab, we're a fiscally conservative company. We are over 90 years old, and we're not. We bring very good returns to our investors, and not really known for the corporate philanthropy part, right? I'll give you an example, though, and I think this is the bright side of things. I heard from the Nature Conservancy that the project that they did is starting flow of water in the Colorado River back into the ocean again. So the aerial sea trend can be reversed. And if you look at the Nature Conservancy or organizations like that, many NGOs, a lot of the funding comes from the private sector that recognizes that some of these natural capital resources are very critical for their long-term survival. So one of the lessons we learned from projects like that is we need to do the same here. It's not good enough to talk about how much we are mining or extracting groundwater in the Twin Cities region. It's important to understand why. And the reason why is that it's much less expensive for municipalities to take clean groundwater, just pump it out and ship it, instead of taking water from the Mississippi River, which we used to in the Twin Cities. Over 80% of the water, when it was just the cities, came from the Mississippi. It's a lot dirtier. So what can we do from conservation and restoration that can restore the quality of the water in the river so that we'll actually start using it? And we seeded $500,000 just before, I think, late last year to start Mississippi River Headwaters Protection Fund. So it's a water fund similar to water funds that have been developed in East Africa in particular that have been very successful, a couple of water funds in Ecuador and other places in Latin America that have been very successful, almost entirely funded through corporate philanthropy. And our hope is that our seed money, the hope is TNC is hoping to raise close to $20 million purely from corporate philanthropy to drive this action that will benefit the community and indirectly all of us businesses who rely on these communities. So I think that's a very critical piece of the long-term solution because taxpayer dollars aren't coming. They just aren't there.
Yeah, really. I mean, I haven't known any government scientist who's happy with the amount of money they receive from government. But it is true, it is a challenge to find sort of funding. So it really does drive innovative approaches, sort of public-private partnerships on research, governments and the private sector. And then really the private sector also sort of identifying some of the things. It really means that if you think of this region, the upper Midwest here and the Canadian prairies, as changing climates, as climate change happens, our whole sort of cropping systems are going to change. So it really does need people working together, whether it's government scientists, university scientists, the private sector, to look at how do we start mitigating, how do we start changing, how do we develop agricultural systems that are less water, that require less water intensive in terms of their use. Those are the kinds of things that are starting to happen where you have people starting to look at those questions and starting to work together across in regions together to develop those answers. If there's one place in the world that has a leg up on that, it is the United States and Canada in terms of our advanced systems, our abilities to get those kinds of things done. So those are the sort of shifts, and it really does mean governments and the private sector working a lot more closely together.
Just have one other brief comment to that, and that is, as I mentioned earlier, with the things like the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funding, which is federal funding, and then we have the Outdoor Heritage Fund and Clean Water Fund here in Minnesota, the time isn't going to get any better than it is right now in terms of the public funding dollars to get this work done. But it takes that third leg of the stool, the private funding, to be able to leverage that. And it often doesn't even take as much. You don't have to match it 50 to 50 or 1-to-1. But it is that private philanthropy that really can help drive larger investments from the public side. And we're seeing that, but I think to really get some of this work done, it's going to require more. I think that's going to be the next investment we're going to have to make.
And the last word, so from the Academy, what's your perspective of how much that's impacted research in this area?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this is a little bit inside baseball now with academic dean and a former department head. But I did work in the federal government involved in science policy for a couple of years. And one of the interesting things I've heard about the way we as a people come together and enable scientific discovery through research dollars, whatever it is, it seems that the system that we built immediately following World War II has got us to today, but we're on the verge of something different. So the whole system of strong federal control over research dollars, funneling into universities, it worked very well. We did a tremendous amount of stuff with that, but that system's breaking. And success rates of proposals are way down. Something has to happen, and we have to look to a new funding model. We have to look to a new kind of partnership between the public and ourselves so we can do the work that, frankly, we do because we're just incorrigibly curious people, and we can't help ourselves. We do it because of that, but it's the public who needs that information. And some new model has to come together that involves the public and involves maybe less role for feds, more for states, something. But I do feel like we're just sort of sitting here thinking we need a new way to get this work done, and we have to figure out what it's going to be.
Did you
I
have
was just going to add, I mean, typically human beings are very good at reacting to disasters or things go wrong, and that's when when you say if you have a big drought or a big flood, money becomes available to help out, right, in terms of flood relief or drought relief. One of the challenges, and while those things are happening, then people talk about, well, we've got to do something about it. We have to get ahead of the curve. We have to figure out ways to understand what's going on and avoid that. But typically, once the initial disaster or the initial issue sort of subsides and we move forward, freeing up those resources, which at one time say, yeah, we have to do, gets a lot harder. One of the challenges is we're very good at reacting to problems. What we need to do is get ahead of the curve through things like science and understanding those issues and then moving forward. It's not, we can fix things once they're done, but it often costs way more money to fix them after the fact than trying to stop them from happening in the first place.
Okay, so moving to the questions from the audience. The first one I have here is, the Great Lakes Compact protects the lakes from exports of water. How strong is that protection? Is the compact sacred?
Well, I was going to say, no agreement done by human beings is ever sacred. I mean, it's a political compact. Politicians represent us, right? They don't just spring out of thin air. So they represent us. So if politicians feel there's a very strong political will to change a law or a piece of legislation, that could happen. It can be changed down the future, but at this point in time, and I think, as you, Stephen, say, it really is very strong, because any sort of move to withdraw water has to have the approval of all the other jurisdictions around that. And I can almost guarantee you that the Canadian provinces and Ontario is not going to agree to that.
Raj?
Yeah, the one comment I had, it's interesting, actually. I worked 12 years in Michigan and worked on the Great Lakes Protection Fund, and I worked on other Great Lakes quality restoration projects in New York and on Lake Ontario. And the big resonating message always was, thank goodness for Canada. Otherwise, we'll have the giant sucking sound, all the water in the Great Lakes will be headed. And I think Steve mentioned this, the whole idea of horse trading, right? There's so much horse trading that goes on within domestic politics. You could easily visualize a Corps of Engineers project or a USGS project that would have built this, is it the Chicago River, where the only place where the water flows outside of the St. Lawrence Seaway. And you could see that as being the straw that starts tapping the water to get it to Phoenix, Arizona, except for the fact that it is a multinational issue with Canada in the picture, which makes it a lot harder. And I think that is the biggest strength that the Great Lakes have, is two countries that have very strong collaboration and are very good partners in so many things, share that resource.
Okay. The other thing, in terms of extracting water from one body of water and taking it over into another watershed, it's not just taking quantities of water, and that's bad enough in many ways, but it's what goes with it, the biota.
Yeah.
We call them invasive species, right? So you think of all of those species, those are the unintended consequences of these kinds of large water movements. You mentioned it, Steve, in terms of dams and things like that. But movement of water without thinking through has huge unintended consequences, and in the end, huge costs to clean it up, and sometimes it's almost impossible. You think of zebra mussels, you think of Asian carp, you think of the water hyacinths, all of those examples, right, were all nice unintended consequences, and now are almost impossible to manage and destroy, and not just wreaking havoc on the environment, but affecting the economic and social fabric of communities.
So a sort of related question. So if we succeed, as your slides were tending to start quantifying the worth of water, don't you encourage its takeover by private companies and deny our poorer brethren access to water? Is it happening already?
I'll try to answer that. That's a great question. I don't know that it necessarily follows that if we find a way to properly value this resource, that it will make it less available. That's also a social question. Once we value it, how do we distribute it? So I don't think they're necessarily in complete contradiction. I think that a really interesting point in the book by Bottle Mania. Anybody else out there read Bottle Mania? It's about kind of the evils of bottled water. One of the most powerful arguments in that book, I really recommend it, was that perhaps the most disturbing thing about the explosive growth in bottled water is the tendency to privatize that. So if a large fraction of the population is spending relatively small amount of money to get clean water commercially through bottles, the political will to maintain a public high-quality water distribution system goes down. And so it's not just the hydrocarbons that were used to make the bottle and the energy it takes to move this stuff. All of that is something to think about. But it is this change in the social fabric, really, about how we presently sort of accept the idea that we come together and where we can afford in places like the U.S. and Canada, we provide water to everyone at relatively low cost. Do we want that to go away? And I thought that was a really important point of that book.
Yeah. That's related to a question by one of the audience. What's the effect of California's water shortage? What effect does California's water shortage, gosh, I can't pronounce this. What effect on California's water shortage does Monsanto's use of aquifer water to fill plastic bottles make? I mean, is that what you were referring to there in terms of the impact of?
I don't know the numbers. I can't imagine a circumstance where filling bottled water for sale for gas stations and grocery stores has an effect at the level that we're talking about the California drought. I don't think hydrologically that's
Yeah,
possible.
there's a huge component of reputational risk associated with bottled water, right? And the California question is particularly interesting. Many of you probably read news stories about, I think it was the U.S. Forest Service water rights that a bottled water company had that they were over-extracting. And the same bottled water company in Cadillac, Michigan, had a bottled water plant and changed the water rights laws in Michigan because there was a pond I think 80 or 90 miles away that was drying up because of their bottled water operation that had an endangered amphibian species.
Okay.
And that really dramatically changed. So it can lead to dramatic changes, some of these visible stories, even though the quantities are not that big. And the same bottled water company in Sudan made a commitment, social commitment, that we will provide as much clean water. They put a bottled water plant and they said we'll provide as much clean water to the community as we are shipping out of this plant. And guess what? It resulted in the largest migration of populations in Sudan outside of war. People moving actually created a whole new city around their bottled water plant because there was no availability of clean water. So it's really interesting what companies do in terms of perception and reputational risk and what stories get headlines and what actually happens on the ground. But the actual quantities are not that significant on a regional scale, but on a time basis or a very local basis, it can be quite significant for ecosystem services or human use.
So a quick one for Dr. Sterner. If you didn't have a limitation of money, what would your priorities be in your research?
I would, a very scientifically unsexy thing is to observe nature carefully in a sustained, high-frequency way. If I had tools available that could tell me what these systems are doing in a geographically rigorous way over time, summer and winter, I could answer a lot of questions. But we are feeling our way around with very incomplete information. And so it would take a significant investment, but simply observing these systems in a more rigorous way would be incredibly helpful. And we've made a lot of strides in observing systems, but there are some things that we still don't measure at all or do it very haphazardly, very spottily. And so
is that the lack of sensory technology, or is it?
Sensory technology, yeah, well, lack of technology, I mean, technology could potentially solve almost anything, but we're not quite there yet with technology that we could deploy to make some of the most fundamental measurements. We still need people to do some of the fundamental measurements that are necessary to be made. So I think this isn't just sort of me in the Great Lakes. We have a very poor track record of generating rigorous data to allow us to know what effects we're having. So this is very true in all kinds of hydrological sciences. I served on a government panel that did some review of stuff that the Army Corps was doing. I developed a very deep respect for the Army Corps in terms of the restoration projects that they were doing. And I learned at the same time that they were basically forbidden by federal law ever to study the effect of what they did. Their mission was to do a project and get out. They were forbidden to stick around and see what happened after they did their project. That's wrong. It's not their fault, but we have a lot of that going on where we don't have just the observational data that we would need, and it is expensive to do that. So unlimited budget, that's the first thing I would do, honestly. Better, longer, more sustained observations. Oh, good, thanks.
So for the Consulate General, is Canada okay with us?
Why wouldn't we? 200 years of peaceful coexistence. No, I mean, if you think, no, quite, I mean, you really think about, so 1909 was the this environmental agreement, the Boundary Waters Agreement, and out of that came the International Joint Commission, which is as vibrant and strong as then as it is today as it is then. And in fact, that's going to be one of the key pieces in the puzzle as we look at the joint management of our shared waters. So we have a remarkable capacity, especially in areas of environment where we have come together and worked together on many things. It's taken it takes a while for people to understand what the issues are. You think of acid rain, or you think of invasive species, all of those things. Once the two countries understand the science and what's happening, then there becomes a political will to do things about those. And they all stem from that. In many ways, that's the grandfather of all of that sort of that spirit of working together to fix our problems in cooperation together. And you think of all of those agreements, they've all been not only tremendously good for the environment. You think of the acid rain regulations and then sulfur dioxide emission reductions. You think about those at the time of the creation of the EPA back 20, 30 years ago, whenever it happened. There's huge controversy about this is going to be the end of industry, the end of the economy, huge lots of jobs. In fact, for both economies, it's proved just quite the opposite. So one of the heartening things I've learned from looking at the history of environmental agreements together is to do them well and to be effective, it needs new innovations, new technologies, which does create jobs, which does create new ideas. And that's, I think, where we have to look at as we're looking at the Great Lakes system as here and around the world. What are the issues? What are the solutions to those? The technology can be developed because people are very innovative to create technologies. Then it's having the right sort of institutions and governance to allow those to be implemented with the right policy instruments. And those are both public and private, market-driven policy instruments, as well as public policy instruments like regulations, incentives, those sorts of things.
I have two quick comments here. One is it's not just policies and regulations, right? This is another very inspiring Canadian story. If you remember all the Clean Water Act and everything, Lake Ontario, there was a photographer in Canada who was able to actually fix his film on ambient water in Lake Ontario in Toronto. And that was a much bigger eye-opener for the executives at Eastman Kodak. I don't know how many of us remember film here, but than any regulation or policy could ever have done. So there is a human emotional touch aspect of it that is quite phenomenal. And the jobs thing is a very touchy issue. If we think about it, in the 19th century, the single most powerful political debate against abolishing slavery was that it will affect jobs. Think about it.
Well, I think we got to stop there. The hour's drawn late. And on behalf of the Freshwater Society and the College of Biological Sciences, I want to thank Dr. Sterner and our panelists for a robust discussion tonight. There are many of these questions that I didn't get to, and I apologize, but I encourage you to come down and ask your questions personally. Special thanks to our event partner, the Canadian Consulate General. And as always, remember to grab your membership forms on the way out. And thanks again for joining us this evening.